Between 1610 and 1791, members of the Society of Jesus rode home from North America. Their reports were collected, edited, and printed in Paris, and later assembled by Reuben Goldthwait into 71 narrative volumes. This is what those volumes record: the routes, the people, the purposes, the methods, and the conduct. That last point governs everything that follows. These are not neutral transcripts. They were written to be persuasive to a European audience that funded the mission. Indigenous speech in them passes through interpreters, through missionary memory, through annual compilation, through translation, and through editing. A quoted speech in the relations is not a stenographic record. So the method here is to separate what the document proves from what the document asserts, and to grade the difference. Every one of the 71 narrative volumes is represented in a coverage matrix and assigned to at least one mapped corridor. Volumes 72 and 73 are indexes and are excluded as chronicles. 14 macro corridors reconstruct the principal mission, exploration, diplomatic, military chaplaincy, and suppression routes. 42 contact groups are registered. 68 sites are mapped. 26 conduct incidents are ledgered against 15 modern law charge lines. What is not claimed matters just as much. This is not a satellite reconstruction of every trip. Indigenous towns moved. Names changed. Annual reports compressed and mediated individual journeys. A route line here connects high-confidence hubs documented in a volume group. It is a corridor schematic. It is not a claim that anyone paddled in a straight line. 4 rules govern the legal half of this work. First, the comparison is counterfactual and non-retroactive. The question is how the same conduct would be classified under modern law, not whether a man dead for 300 years can be charged. Second, the analysis separates the act, the actor, the Jesuit role, the mental state, the context, and the strength of the evidence and grades each of them apart from the others. Third, presence is not complicity. Writing a report about a massacre is not committing one. Serving as a chaplain to an army is not ordering what the army does. Fourth, the tiers are kept distinct. A domestic offense, a war crime, a crime against humanity, and genocide are 4 different legal things with 4 different sets of required elements. Collapsing them is the most common error in this subject, and it is not made here. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is used as a rights benchmark. It is not used as a penal code. Part 1. The corridors. This is the whole system. 14 corridors, spanning 180 years, from the Bay of Fundy to Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico. Read it as 3 pulses. An Atlantic opening in Acadia. A long ascent. Lawrence spine feeding a deep inland push into Wendat country and then into Haudenosaunee towns. And a western and southern extension along the Great Lakes into the Mississippi and down to New Orleans. The last 2 lines on the map are not missions at all. They are the suppression of the order and what survived it. The chronology corrects a common misreading. The long bars are not expeditions. They are recurring networks that operated for decades. The Lawrence system runs from 1625 into the 1700s. The Haudenosaunee corridor runs 67 years. Against those, the short bars are discrete events. Albany to Hudson Bay in 71 and 72, Marquette and Joliet on the Mississippi in 73, Celeron in the Ohio country in 1749, Roubaud at Fort William Henry in 57. The Eastern Group. 5 corridors and the foundation of everything that follows. Part 1. The Acadian opening, 1611 to 1613. Pierre Beard, Enemon Mass, Gilbert Duthet, and Jack Quentin, working from Port Royal along the Bay of Fundy and the Maine coast among the Micmac, Wallastoqiak, and Passamaquoddy. They arrived by Atlantic ship. They moved by indigenous canoe with indigenous pilots. That pattern holds for the next 180 years. Route 2. Lawrence and the Northern Winter Missions, from 1625 onward, running in the record all the way to Volume 71. Paul Ledune, Charles Lalemant, Jack Buteau, and Danao, Gabriel Druillettes. Quebec, Tedazak, Sillery, Tuariviez, Montreal, Chickademy, Laxating and the Attic-Amequite interior. This is the administrative spine. It is also where the institutional apparatus appears, hospitals, seminaries, and the deliberate concentration of mobile communities into sedentary mission settlements. Remember that word, sedentary? It returns in Part 2 as a legal question. Route 3. Wendat Country, the Deep Inland Mission. Jean de Brebeuf, Antoine Daniel, Ambroise Davost, Jerome Lalemant, Isaac Jogues, Charles Garnier, Noel Chabanel, Paul Regnault. A 700-mile canoe and portage corridor up the Ottawa River, over the Mattawa Portage, through Lake Nipissing and down the French River to Georgian Bay. The objective was not simply baptism. It was a regional Christian center with village missions, a master Wendat language, children in seminaries, and a systematic written record of Wendat society and religion. Sainte Marie among the Hurons was the fixed residence. The corridor ends in 1650 on Christian Island. Route 4. The Haudenosaunee Corridor, 1642 to 1709. This one begins in captivity. Isaac Jogues and Joseph Bressani entered Mohawk country as prisoners, not as envoys. What follows is 67 years of captive ministry, peace negotiation, resident chapels in Confederacy towns, strategic intelligence gathering, and the movement of converts north to Conowick. The relations are candid about why Haudenosaunee military power decided whether New France survived. Route 5. The Wabanaki and New England Corridor. Gabriel Droulet, Sepasson, Rail, Jack Bigot, Pierre Raubard. Sillery, Odanak, the Kennebec Mission at Norridgewock, the Penobscot, and diplomatic embassies that reached Boston and Plymouth. Wabanaki territory was the borderland between two empires, and the mission sat inside that fact. West and North. 3 corridors that convert a mission network into a geography of empire. Route 6. The Upper Great Lakes Network, 1641 to 1700. Sault Ste. Marie, St. Ignace at Michilimackinac, Chequamegon Bay, Green Bay, the Fox, Wisconsin Portage. The method here is worth noticing. The missionaries deliberately cited themselves as strategic gathering places so they could preach at intertribal councils. They used calumet diplomacy and gifts. They wintered in villages. 10 or more nations appear in this corridor alone. Route 7. Charles Albinel to Hudson Bay, 1671 to 72. Quebec, Tadoussac, Chicoutimi, Lac Saint-Jean, Lake Mistassini, Rupert Bay. Read the stated objectives together. Preach, reach the northern nations, verify the route, assert French presence, and assess English trade competition. This is a state-backed reconnaissance with a chaplain's justification attached, and the relations do not hide it. Route 8. Marquette and Joliet, 1673. 2 canoes. A portage from the Fox to the Wisconsin, down the Mississippi to the Arkansas and back through the Illinois and the Chicago Portage. The purpose was to find the river's course, make diplomatic contact, assess trade and geopolitics, and scout mission prospects. The result was confirmation that the river ran to the Gulf and not the Pacific, and the route advice that made it possible came from the communities they passed. Here is the single most important structural finding in Part 1, and it runs against the way the story is usually told. The inland mission was not self-propelled. It depended on indigenous canoes, on portage knowledge, on pilots and guides, on interpreters, on host communities, on winter food systems, and on political permission to enter and remain. Not one of those is incidental assistance. Every one of them is a structural necessity. Remove any single item from that list and the corridor collapses. The missionaries knew this. They wrote it down. Read the methods column of the route ledger and you are reading a dependency schedule. The second cross-corridor finding is about purpose. The missionaries were after more than individual baptism. Their own writings describe schools and seminaries, hospitals, sedentary mission settlements, diplomatic influence, access to trade routes, territorial intelligence, and the strengthening of New France. Evangelization and empire are not separable in this record, because the men writing the record did not separate them. Down the river. This is where the character of the enterprise changes. Route 9. The Illinois and Miami resident missions, 1675 to 1712. Kaskaskia, Cahokia, Fort de Chartres, the Peoria villages, the Chicago Portage. Permanent missions, parish structures, schools, and linguistic materials. The mission is now embedded in a colonial settlement zone. Route 10. Louisiana, 1699 to 1763. Paul du Poisson, Jean Sowell, Mathurin Le Petit, Louis Vivier, Etienne Watrin, Antoine Sennett. Kaskaskia down to Natchez, the Yazoo, New Orleans, and Mobile. The last four corridors: claim-making, war, dissolution, and what survived. Route 11. Celebrant at Blainville and the Jesuit geographer Joseph Pierre de Bas-de-Camps in the Ohio country, 1749. They took latitude observations, held formal councils, distributed presents, and buried lead plates and displayed royal arms as devices of territorial claim. They warned communities against trading with the English. Bas-de-Camps recorded the replies. Route 12. Pierre Aubade with the French army and allied Abenaki at Fort William Henry, 1757. Route 13 is not a mission at all. Between 1763 and 64, the French crown suppressed the Society of Jesus and liquidated its colonial holdings. Administrative seizure, river transport, chapels closed or destroyed, property shipped, including, the record says, people. Route 14. What continued after? Pierre Potier at Detroit, Jean-Baptiste de la Brosse among the New Sebastian Murin in the Illinois county. Parishes, dictionaries, catechisms, and a documentary in point in 1791. The contact register holds 42 groups, 38 indigenous nations and communities, plus enslaved Africans and Afro-descended people, plus the French and English colonial populations. Each entry carries its years, its places, the Jesuits involved, the stated purpose, the method of contact, and the volume range where the evidence sits. 2 entries in that list deserve separate notice, because they are not contacts in the same sense. The register records enslaved Africans and Afro-descended people in New Orleans, Louisiana, and the Illinois estates, and it describes the relationship in one line. Mission claims coexisted with ownership and use of enslaved labor. Part 2. The Conduct Ledger. Every incident is broken into 7 fields before anyone is allowed to call it anything. Who was the primary actor? What the Jesuit role was, if any. Which attribution class it falls into. Where the source sits, by volume and printed page, so the claim can be checked against the page image. What the modern offense analog would be. An evidentiary score from 1 to 5. And mandatory on every single row, a caveat stating what the passage does not prove. That last field is the discipline. A ledger without it is an accusation with footnotes. Here is how the 26 incidents distribute across attribution classes. Direct Jesuit or institutional conduct. French or mixed colonial conduct. Indigenous third-party conduct. English third-party conduct. Mitigation and victim context. And rights or policy context. The distribution is the argument. A large share of the violence in the relations was not committed by Jesuits, and saying so honestly is what makes the remainder credible. Plotted, the incidents cluster in 4 places. Gaza, Lawrence, and Quebec, where the institutional policy documents originate. Wendat Country and the Mohawk Valley, where the captivity and war material sits. The Ohio and Illinois Country, and Louisiana, where the darkest concentration on the map is found. The first cluster is direct Jesuit conduct, and it concerns children. JRC 001, 1637, near Ossasane in Wendat Country. Charles Garnier baptized the newborn covertly, using a wet handkerchief without the parents' knowledge. The narrative itself anticipates that the mother might not have consented. That is not an inference. The document says so. JRC 002, 1640, a sick child baptized without the mother's knowledge. What this proves is intentional concealment. JRC 003 is the strongest of the 3, scored for 1640, A 4-year-old child was baptized under the pretext of administering medicine, deliberately performed so as not to appear to be a rite. The child later died, and here the caveat has to be read as carefully as the conduct. The source does not show that the baptism caused the death. Homicide is not supported by this passage. What is supported, and strongly, is deception. A modern analog would reach unauthorized touching and interference with parental decision-making, with the severity low absent injury. The moral weight and the legal weight are not the same, and this ledger declines to pretend otherwise. The second cluster is not incidents. It is program. And in evidentiary terms it is stronger than the incidents, because the mission wrote its own strategy down. JRC 005. 1637, Quebec. The relation argues that keeping Indigenous children at Quebec would provide, in the document's own word, hostages, and would thereby protect French lives and commerce. That is an explicit statement of intended leverage over other people's children. Scored 4. The caveat is precise, and it is the difference between history and prosecution. A stated rationale is not a completed offense. Modern hostage-taking requires actual seizure or detention plus a coercive demand. The proposal is documented. The completed crime is not. JRC 006. 1638. The mission program described as 4 batteries, language work, a hospital, seminaries for Indigenous children, and settlement concentration, aimed at defeating the Indigenous religion as what the text calls an empire of Satan. That is the assimilation policy in the mission's own language. JRC 008. The same year, material inducements described as golden chains used to pull mobile communities toward sedentary Christian settlements. Together these 3 establish something the individual baptism incidents cannot: a documented institutional policy of coercive assimilation, with children as the primary instrument and an explicit security rationale attached. And now the strongest direct modern crime analog in the entire corpus. 3 rows, all scored 5. All direct institutional Jesuit conduct. JRC 018. 1738, New Orleans. Father Mathurin Le Petit, writing in volume 69 at printed page 296, refers to the slaves of our residence. Those are his words about the Society's own house. This is not inference from silence or from context. It is an owner describing property in a letter intended for his superiors. JRC 024. 1763. A suppression-era document in Volume 70 describes a quite large gang of enslaved people cultivating Jesuit land and practicing trades. Note the caveat: gang is the source's own labor group term, and the passage gives no count. JRC 025. 1764. The count appears: 48 enslaved black people formerly belonging to the Jesuits, shipped after the Crown confiscated the order's property. 48 named is a number in the record, held by a religious order, then treated as an asset in a liquidation. The caveats hold here too, and they matter. This proves institutional slaveholding. It does not prove the individual acts or the knowledge of every Jesuit in New France. And the record carefully separates prior Jesuit ownership from the Crown's later disposition of those people as confiscated property. 2 different actors, 2 different acts, both documented. The third class is French or mixed colonial conduct, where Jesuits are present but the actor is someone else. JRC 009. 1666, the Mohawk Valley. French royal troops found the villages largely abandoned and burned the palisades, the cabins, the stored corn and beans, and the standing crops. The relation itself expected the result to be hunger and death. Under modern law, this reaches destruction of civilian property, pillage, and starvation-related war crime theories, subject to the usual elements. 2 Jesuits, Albanel and Rafax, were with that column as chaplains and are described as inspiring the troops' piety. The evidence of French destruction is very strong. Jesuit offense-specific intent is unresolved, and the ledger says so. The relation does not prove that the chaplains ordered or specifically encouraged burning homes and food. That is the honest grade. It is not an acquittal and it is not a conviction. JRC 016. 1731, Louisiana. The relation states that 3 enslaved black people were abandoned or handed over to Choctaw allies and burned alive. Very strong documentary evidence. And again, the ledger separates the actors, the officials who transferred those people, the allies who carried out the killing, and the Jesuit who wrote it down. The chronicler is a reporter here, not shown as an actor, but the transfer of a person to a known risk of execution is itself a modern offense, and it is attributed where it belongs. JRC 022. The petty trade in the Illinois and Louisiana colonies. Illegal distribution, resulting disorder and violence. The 4th and 5th classes are third-party conduct, where the Jesuits are victims or witnesses. 1613. An English expedition under Samuel R. Gall destroyed the French mission at Saint-Sauveur on Mount Desert and killed Gilbert du Thet. 1643. Isaac Jogues, René Goupil, Joseph Bressani, and their companions were seized in the Mohawk Valley. The accounts describe beatings, mutilation, forced marches, and the killing of Goupil. 1649. The capture, torture, and killing of Jean de Brébeuf and Gabriel Lalemant during attacks in Wendat country. 1729. The Natchez attack on French settlements and the killing of Paul du Poisson. The same year at the Yazoo post, Jean Sowell. 2 rules apply to all of these, and they are not softening. First, attribution runs to the named or described captors and units, never to a nation or a people collectively. Second, the sources are devotional and martyr-centered, written by captives and survivors, and they must be read as such. The Natchez entry adds a third point: the colonial record itself concedes French abuses and escalating colonial pressure preceded the uprising, and responsibility has to stay incident-specific. One incident carries its own class, and it exists to keep the ledger honest in the other direction. JRC 023. Fort William Henry, 1757. After the English garrison capitulated, the narrative records robbery, the killing of sick and wounded people, and abductions. Under modern law, that reaches murder, pillage, hostage-taking, and attacks on persons horsed to combat. And the Jesuit in that narrative, Pierre Rabaud, reports breaking prisoners' bonds and helping to protect threatened people. A ledger that only recorded Jesuit wrongdoing would be a brief, not an atlas. Rabaud accompanied the Allied force as its chaplain. He also intervened. Both facts are in the same document and both are recorded here. The caveat still applies: the episode must not be attributed collectively to all Allied nations, and French command knowledge and control require separate proof. The last class is rights and policy conduct that is historically serious but does not map cleanly onto a criminal statute. JRC 021. The Celeron expedition of 1749, with Bonnet-Camps as chaplain, geographer, and recorder. Lead plates buried. Royal arms display. An entire watershed claimed. Communities warned against English trade. And replies recorded which the edition's own editor characterized as extorted by fear. This is dispossession and coercive diplomacy. Under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it engages territorial consent directly. Under ordinary domestic criminal law, it is usually not a standalone offense without specific coercive acts. Both statements are true, and the ledger declines to resolve the tension by overstating one of them. JRC 010. Albano on the Hudson Bay Route, 1672. Applying religious and diplomatic pressure to guides, including warnings framed as divine displeasure. Scored 2. Moderate and contextual. The record does not establish detention, physical force, or a legally cognizable threat. Part 3. The charge matrix and the findings that are not established. 15 charge lines. They sort into 3 tiers. Tier 1, very strong. Enslavement and forced labor attributed to Jesuit residences and estates, resting on explicit references to enslaved people belonging to those residences, a large enslaved labor gang, and 48 people formerly owned by the order. This is the strongest finding in the entire study. The limit is that individual responsibility still requires proof of authority, participation, and knowledge for any particular man. Trafficking and forced transfer. Strong, but actor separated. Prior ownership is Jesuit. The transport and disposal after confiscation is the Crown's. Pillage and destruction of civilian property. Very strong and attributed to French troops and Allied forces, not to the order. Tier 2. Strong evidence, conditional criminal elements. Religious persecution and forced assimilation attributed to the mission system, resting on the seminaries, the sedentism policy, the coercive theology, the material leverage, and the stated aim of destroying indigenous religion. The policy evidence is strong. The criminal classification is conditional because international persecution requires severe deprivation of fundamental rights, discriminatory intent, and for a crime against humanity, a widespread or systematic attack. Kidnapping and hostage-taking. Policy intent documented in the mission's own words. Completed Jesuit offense not established. Fraud and deceptive practice. Strong evidence of deception from the baptism disguised as medicine. Offense classification uncertain because modern fraud usually requires a property or other specified harm. Battery. Moderate direct evidence from the covert baptisms. Severity low absent injury. Notice what Tier 2 really is. It is a set of findings where the historical record is stronger than the legal category. That gap is not a weakness in the evidence. It is a fact about what criminal law was built to do. Murder is strongly documented across the corpus. It is not documented as direct Jesuit killing anywhere in this ledger. Torture likewise, strongly documented, overwhelmingly third party. Then the hardest line in the matrix. Aiding and abetting. Possible in selected settings. Not conclusively established. Jesuit chaplains accompanied the 1666 Mohawk campaign and the 1739 Chickasaw campaign. Colonial officials handed victims to Allied executioners, and the limit is stated without flinching. Presence, chaplaincy, or general encouragement is insufficient without substantial assistance and the required knowledge or intent as to a specific crime. Some readers will find that limit too generous. It is the same standard that protects everyone else, and applying it selectively would make every other finding in this document worthless. War crimes. Potentially supportable for specific incidents, attributed to incident-specific military or allied actors, subject to conflict classification, protected status, nexus, jurisdiction, and non-retroactivity. Tier 3. 4 findings that are not established, and the reasoning is as important as the conclusion. Crimes against humanity. Not fully established on these excerpts. Enslavement is an enumerated act, and persecution may be relevant, but the contextual elements, a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population, an organizational policy, and the actor's knowledge of it, all require broader proof than the selected passages provide. Genocide. Not established. The corpus documents assimilation, severe violence, displacement, and slavery. It does not document the required specific intent to physically or biologically destroy a protected group as such. Cultural destruction alone does not satisfy the modern definition, and forcible transfer of children also requires genocidal intent, which is not shown here. Sexual violence. No direct Jesuit offense identified in the selected ledger. And read the limit carefully. Because it is not a clearance, absence from this ledger is not proof that no sexual violence occurred anywhere in 71 volumes. Intentional disease spread. Not established. Epidemics run through the relations constantly. The selected evidence does not show a plan to infect anyone. Transmission, negligence, and deliberate weaponization are 3 different claims, and they must not be collapsed into one. It would be easy to write a version of this document that charged everything. It would also be worthless. The 4 not established findings are what make the 3 very strong findings credible. If the same method that produces 48 enslaved people in the order's own suppression record also produced a genocide finding on thin evidence, no serious reader would trust either one. 48 people, held by a religious order, recorded in that order's own paperwork. That does not need inflation to matter. 5 cautions carry forward. Verify before quoting. Every quotation in this material should be checked against the page images and the original language before it goes into print. Locator discipline. One row is flagged in the ledger itself. JRC 020, the TADOSAC labor description, carries a note that its digital locator requires verification before quotation. It is scored 1, context only, and it should stay there until the page is confirmed. No collective guilt. The markers show source incidents. The modern law labels are counterfactual and non-retroactive. Nothing here assigns responsibility to a nation, a religion, or an ancestry. Mediated voices. Every indigenous speech in this corpus reached the page through interpreters, missionary memory, annual compilation, translation, and editorial revision. And the next work is already specified. Individual missionary itineraries can be extracted from the route ledger for micromapping at the village scale. 71 volumes, 14 corridors, 68 sites, 42 contact groups, 26 ledgered incidents, 15 charge lines, 3 findings graded very strong, and 4 graded not established. The relations were written to justify a mission to the people paying for it. Read against themselves, with the actors separated from the witness and the evidence separated from the assertion. They document something their authors did not intend to leave behind. That is what the record is for.